Great, next. All right, so for those of you who were here last week, this will look familiar. We've got this planning process overview. If you are going to start planning, either for your own operation or for someone else's operation, there are things that you're going to need to do before you even start. You need to set up your operation. We had a great question about some methods of storing data securely, things like that. And then you need to be able to connect with the people that you can provide value to. So we're not going to cover that in this session, but we have it in our workbook. And then we've got this sort of context focus chunk where we're looking for ecological context, we're looking for social and cultural context. We, of course, are looking for financial context. And so in last week, we really talked about this operational context. So like what is going on with management, what is going on with the family dynamics, that sort of thing. And we use the site visit as one example of how you might start to collect that information. And then we'll talk about the ecological context more today with looking at some soil health in-field metrics. We're not going to cover the financial context today, but this is where we're sitting. These first two sessions we're really focusing on this context gathering piece. The next session, the next webinar, we're going to be focusing on this pathfinding piece, where we're going to use that context to set goals going forward. And then after all of that is done, then we actually write the plan. If you'll remember from last week, we have ways of making that useful to the plan partner. And then, of course, we need to implement. And so that's sort of where, and in that implementation phase is really where networking is really key. So we're laying some of the groundwork now, and we're going to come back to that later. So next. All right, so we have these sort of markers, these milestones of this planning process. And then, of course, we have these key skills. And so again, last week, we really talked about listening, that active listening skill, some trust building activities, the setting working agreements, that sort of thing. Of course, there's going to be technical skills that are needed. And as we mentioned, we're not going to cover sort of the basics of soil chemistry, soil physics, or anything. We have resources that we can point you to if you want to get caught up with that. But we also have this big piece of networking is a really important skill. And so we're really going to highlight that today, as well as touch on the facilitation. So we've got these sort of process and the skills that align with those different parts of the process. Next. All right, so let's, just because I can't talk about the healthy soil principles enough in my life, just a quick reminder that these principles, we align all of our planning process around these principles. We really like them because they're not prescriptive. It's a really big difference to say you shouldn't till this field than to say, how can we minimize disturbance, right? Those are really different approaches to a conversation and really putting the plan partner in the driver's seat. So while we're looking at that, these are also the principles that help us guide what we look for when we do a site assessment. We want to see what the snapshot in time is right now. You know, if there's data of how it changed, that's great. But how do those properties relate to these healthy soil principles? Because that can tell us a lot about where we can move the lever most strongly. And then again, as from last time, lots of people noticed that we're missing number 6, which is context, but we consider context sort of in a broader overarching framework, but you're not wrong if you think it's missing. Next. All right, and so I'm gonna sort of like jump to the end, put the sort of the outcomes up first, and we'll sort of tell you how we get here for the rest of this session. But if you're looking in your book, in the appendix under 8, I think it's 8.1a, under that little X, we have, again, we're trying to match up healthy soil principles with what we're seeing in the field or getting from lab tests. And there's a bunch of different ways we can do that. We can just talk about the management activities and go, what are you planting? How many different species are you planting? That relates to that biodiversity question. We can talk about tillage. How are you managing your tillage? Can it be reduced? Can we reduce disturbance? What are you already doing that are related to that? How are animals integrated? How much of the time is there a living root in the ground? Are you putting in a cover crop? Or, is there continuous grazing, or do you let that rest and that root recover for a long period of time? So there's ways to relate what people are already doing to the healthy soil principle. And so for what we're talking about today, all of that information would go into year 0. And so you would write in, it was a multi-species cover crop. So you would write that in the sort of diversity area, as well as the living root in the ground, that there's a lot of root in the ground, but maybe there's tillage a couple times a year. And so what we want to be able to see is going out through subsequent years when we're actually implementing, and we'll see if we're moving towards those healthy soil principles. Are we adding even more species? Have we started integrating goats or sheep or something else that wasn't there before? That would tell us that we're moving in the direction towards healthy soil, because we're aligning our management with more and more and more healthy soil principles. Next. And then the other part of this form is getting connected to what we can observe in the field or use lab tests for, and that sort of thing. And that's sort of how we can gauge the responses. So we might, in our management, be doing a lot of things that are relating to healthy soil principles, but this is kind of where the rubber hits the road of, are we reducing bare ground by doing that? If we're looking at our bare ground metric in year 0, and then it's not changing in year 1, and then it's not changing in year 2, that might mean we need to start thinking in a more adaptive management style of going, this might not be working the way we want it to, right? We might use these observations to tell us about our management and our implementation. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail of this exact form. Again, we talk about it in our workbook that you can reference, but this is where we're going. We're trying to collect information at a baseline that can then be used to make decisions throughout the planning process. Next.
Hi, so I think I'm going to talk about this section of the webinar. My name's Amy Larson. Although I wasn't part of the site visit at Chilenzo, I did meet the farm team during their baseline soil share, their soil monitoring workshop, and so got to meet the team, got to see the site, and get more familiar with their operation. So just to land you all, I guess, a little bit more squarely in this the farm and the site. Chilenzo is a diversified operation located in Cerrillos, New Mexico. They've got a lot of projects and programs, a lot of great ideas and visions going on that they're working towards. And so it's really exciting to work with folks that have worked with big ideas. Our baseline soil testing and monitoring really focused on fields C and D. So they're in a pinon juniper kind of sloped forest, and the slope, the water moves from off of the mesas and the hillsides in field D towards field C. So, thinking about erosion as respective to how they're going to build organic matter is certainly something that they want to consider and keep in mind. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about designing a soil monitoring or a soil share workshop, we want to kind of come with some a framework of questions. But to back up, what do I mean by those terms? The baseline soil monitoring, I'm really talking about doing some initial soil testing, whether it's soil samples that you send off to a lab to then receive data back, or if you want to do on the ground field testing. Certainly you can gather lots of useful and relevant information both ways. But the soil monitoring is kind of that. And then what I'm talking about with a soil share is the idea of doing some field testing and soil monitoring within a collection of stakeholders. So it could be agency folks, Soil and Water Conservation District folks, NRCS, could be neighbors, and anyone interested in learning more about the soils together. So some questions that I like to consider, and certainly this isn't all inclusive, I'm sure there's more, but first of all, what does a producer want to know about their soils? What are their goals? What are their visions? And so designing the test to really get at some of those questions, I think, is important. Then thinking about, what does the soil have to teach us? And so along with that, what do we learn, in doing these soil tests? What does the data tell us about management, about how the operation is aligned with healthy soil principles? Those are some good questions. And then lastly, if you want to do this as kind of a community of practice or within a community or network situation, who should we invite? Who should the producers invite to participate in this workshop and learn together? Next slide. So, obviously kind of the next question is, well, what soil test should we focus on? What should we do within the time that we have together? And it's a little bit outside the scope of this particular webinar to get into those lists and details, but Quivira does have some resources for that talk about field tests and kind of how protocols and how to do that. The planning workbook, of course, is one, and then the soil health workbook is another, and those are both online. But kind of to take a step back, the field tests, the soil is comprised of physical components, biological components, and chemical components, and all of those inform how the soil health. So whether you decide to take soil samples and send it off to a lab to get data that will inform how the soil health is doing, or whether you want to do field tests and learn kind of on the ground together, all of those options are going to help inform the farm and ranch plan. In my opinion, one of the best ways to learn about your soils is to dig a hole. And it doesn't have to be as deep as this hole in the picture that's dug with a backhoe. It could be 12 to 8 inches. But I've found that learning about the soil physical characteristics, are there earthworms? Do you see insects when you dig into the soil? What's the vegetative cover look like? All of that, I think, is really helpful information. How can we use our senses, our sight, our touch? How does the soil smell? All of those, I think, help to understand what's going on within the soil. Next slide. So when we were looking at how to design the soil share workshop at Checkin Farm, one of the things that we wanted to focus on were the soil tests that were required for a particular grant that they had applied for, which is the New Mexico Healthy Soil Grant. So that required us doing an infiltration test, which helps us understand how water's infiltrating through the soil. We wanted to look at soil compaction. And we also looked at the soil aggregation through a slake test and did a vegetative transect, which helped us understand what is the vegetative cover versus the bare ground on site, on field C and D. We also agreed that it was an opportunity, again, for the community to learn together how to do these field tests. So by doing it at Chilenzo Farm, they could also apply those same techniques to their own fields. Learn, how to gather that data, how to understand that data together, and reflect back on what does it tell us about, again, management and the healthy soils principles. So Lorenzo invited members of the Santa Fe Soil and Water Conservation District Board. There were a couple of NRCS staff there, someone from the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy, and some farm neighbors. And so we all had a chance to kind of network and learn from each other. Next slide. So here's an example of our agenda for the baseline soil share. So we spent a lot of time orienting to the site, getting to know each other, getting to know kind of our own strengths and passions related to soil. We then dived into doing some soil sampling demonstrations. So really digging into the soil and learning what's happening on the ground. And then we split up doing the actual soil tests into before and after lunch. So before lunch, we did a vegetative transect and an infiltration test. So we went ahead and did those demonstrations of how to do those soil tests. And then we broke up into teams and we actually did those tests on each field, on each of the fields, field C and field D. So everybody was involved. We all got to record data. We all got to switch off roles between, doing the measurement, recording the data. And so as you can see here, there's Gabriella Coughlin kind of helping us understand more about infiltration and the soils there. So everybody had a role to play. Everybody brought their strengths to that workshop. When we were done with the tests, we reviewed the healthy soils principles, and then we provided time for people to really ask questions if there were things that happened during the tests that they were unsure about, clarified protocols, and got a chance to really hone to again evaluate what they learned about the soils through this process. And then we closed with a wrap up, an evaluation of the workshop, and yeah, closed the workshop. Next slide. So after the workshop was done, we at Quivira took all those data sheets together, we compiled it, we digitized it, and then we really wrapped it up into a report that provided both an analysis and assessment of what those tests told us about what was happening on site. So trying to answer the question, what does the data tell us about the health of the soil? And again, connecting it back to the healthy soil principles. And really using this report, this analysis as a baseline for, as I think Eva mentioned, the next step of the process, which is the pathfinding or goal setting part of the process, part of the planning process. So using what is learned from the baseline soil monitoring event to inform what are some healthy soil goals that they can focus on in the next 3 to 5 years. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Eva.
Thanks, Amy. That is great. Sorry, just checking the chat. All right, so again, we've gone from the top. What are we trying to do? We're trying to get enough data for people to make good decisions, right? We're trying to get the right kind of data that matches the things that they're interested in. How do we do that? But I think another key piece that Amy really touched on is like, as planners, we need to have enough interaction with the people we're working with that they can actually do it on their own and make those assessments on their own. I mean, I know there's some people who are, you know, planning on not only helping the planning, but then maybe helping the implementation and monitoring. But just for the planning process, it's really about empowering the producer to be able to take this process on going forward after the planning process. And so even though, you know, we're not all trained as educators necessarily, but we will be doing facilitating of understanding why things are important, and what's needed. So I love these two quotations. The great aim of education is not knowledge, but action, right? We want people to be able to actually do something with this information. And key for us as facilitators and planners is that learning is not the product of teaching. Like, me just talking at you is probably not going to be as helpful as you sort of digesting this information and seeing how it applies to you, which we can do during the breakout groups a little bit. Learning is the product of the activity of learners, right? So learners have to be doing something. So how do we move that forward next? All right. So I think this is a key thing to know, that learning any new thing causes changes in the brain. And that takes work. Our brains have a lot of blood and are working really hard. And so it actually can be tiring. So that's important to know, that when you're learning, you're working really hard. And so, for example, if you're learning about your soil, some of the results of the field test may be different than you're expecting. And that creates that sort of friction, right? It forces you to think about things. That difficulty is what actually helps you learn, right? And so because learning is difficult, when you feel that difficulty, it actually is helping you to learn. Next. So taking a bigger step back, Amy talked about this case study of our agenda and things that we wanted to get out of it. But for you as a planner going forward and wanting to train someone on a new test, on using a penetrometer, for example, what a useful framework for thinking about how you want to actually do that is to actually use backwards design. So what do you want them to be able to do? Again, that action step at the end of learning. We don't just want them to be able to think about something, we want them to be able to do something. How should they learn it? Are they going to watch a video? Are you just going to tell them? Are they going to get to try it? That's that instruction piece. And then how do we know if they learned it? Again, we planners are sort of trusting people to take this knowledge and have them use that knowledge to make good decisions for themselves going forward. How do we feel confident that they are going to be able to use this again and again, year after year? So this framework of starting from the end and working your way backwards can be really helpful. And we have more information about this in our Healthy Soil workbook. Next. All right. So, for example, our outcome for the soil share that Amy talked about is we want relevant topics and we want to discuss initial findings with stakeholders, right? If that's our outcome, great. We have some nice action verbs. We're going to collect, we're going to discuss. Those are things that you could actually see people doing, that action piece. So our instruction that helped us meet that outcome was the agenda that Amy shared. We have people practicing and then we have people discussing. So we've used our instruction to meet our objectives, and then we can assess. We can just ask ourselves, it's not difficult. Were the assessments completed? Yes or no? Were they relevant to the context of the operation? Yes or no? Like we can just ask ourselves some questions about, did the activities that we do help us meet our outcomes? Next. There's some useful tools. I'm just going to throw back to last week. If you can ask open-ended questions, What do you notice about this hole we just dug? Why do you think there's more bare ground over here than over there? Those kinds of things can stimulate that, like that actual difficult thinking that can help people actually learn and connect that. And then this is I think a key one. I don't know the answer to your question. How would we together find out more? That is a go-to tip. Next. All right, so now here's a sneaky thing. I was talking about teaching, but look at how well this framework fits into planning overall, right? So effective planning, when we get to the pathfinding next week, hang tight for next week, we're going to prioritize our goals and then we're going to work backwards. We're not going to say, here's the next thing I'm doing. We're going to say, where do I want to go? And use that to figure out what's the next thing. So that was just, this is a primer for next week. All right, next. All right, with that, you get to take a break from listening to us talk. I'm going to turn it over to our plan partner, Lorenzo of Chilenzo Farms. And I'm going to just start by asking you to introduce yourself however you would like. And then we're going to just ask you how things went for you, specifically related to the baseline soil share. But of course, anything you would like to add. Over to you, Lorenzo. Who are you and how did you get to be here?
Eva, thank you very much. I think you're going to all be asking to take a break from listening to me very soon too. And please do stop me if I go on too long. How I got here, well, I have been a producer, aka farmer, for 19 months. So I'm going to tell you that story in the shortest way possible. But more important to that, and which is why I give thanks and praise to Eva, Amy, and Catherine, and the rest of the Quivira team, is I have 35 years of professional communications, community building, and program development experience. And in fact, until last week, I was working as communications director for a corporation for 23 years. I have left the dark side and I am fully in the field of regenerative agriculture, health, and humanity. So I'm really happy to be here. And once again, have to give praise to the whole team at Quivira. Would it be for them that we're in such a great position and have learned so much along the way. As was mentioned before, we were lucky to be accepted into the Farmer Rancher Planning Program, and immediately started working with Catherine, who was a super duper counselor in many regards. And I think before we had the workshop, we had a lot of discussions. So I think part of what Eva mentioned earlier was that relationship building, community building is super important coming up to this workshop. So, so with that, a little bit about what we're doing here. My wife and I left New York. I was there for 30 years. I'm originally from Northern California. She's originally from Michigan. The pandemic started and she got hit pretty bad. She's a doctor and was on the front line. This was at a time when they were intubating everybody and about 85% weren't leaving the hospital. So that was really kind of a life-changing moment for us. We had been talking about leaving New York for a while, and she had talked about starting a farm. I grew up in San Jose, California, in suburbia, and like I said, 30 years in New York, and I thought it was a crazy idea. But at the same time, when I turned 50, and I'm now 55, I got that math wrong yesterday. I thought I was 54, but I'm actually 55. At 50, I realized I really need to be a model for my children. And so it so happened about both my wife and I delved into longevity studies and tried to understand how can you live better and extend your lifespan. And once again, once the pandemic hit, we decided we had to move. It just all came together in this big confluence of variables and factors. In fact, like Catherine, I'm a big data cruncher. an analyst. So I put together a spreadsheet of all the places we'd go to. And most of them were in Northern California, but then all the forest fires hit. And my wife said, air quality is number one. So eventually we landed here, and it was absolutely the perfect place to be. So we bought 3 different parcels for 350 acres of land, right butting up against 3,000 acres of BLM. And we started creating a farm. But before we got here, I think what was super important was we started learning. We watched numerous documentaries, read lots of books about regenerative lifestyles and farms. And more importantly, I started reaching out to everybody in the community and in regenerative agriculture and just had conversations. So that's when I learned about Quivira and applied to the program. We've applied to a number of grants and programs, and really I owe all our success to our large network of people and organizations out there that really have got us running as soon as we hit, hit here in Cerrillos, New Mexico. So ultimately, we have evolved from starting essentially a homestead to a farm with 1 full-time farm manager, who I owe a lot of credit to as well, Nina Listro, 2 part-time employees, and a full-time or part-time volunteer who just landed last week, and she'll be here for a few months. And another volunteer is coming to live with us as well. In the interim, we've had a number of other employees and volunteers involved. And ultimately, we've evolved into an organization that focuses on education, community, and research. And that's essentially, where we're at. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the soil health workshop. So the way that came to be was basically a simultaneous regeneration. And on the agenda for the farm ranch plan was to have this soil testing workshop. But at the same time, since I knew very little, my strategy is often to just go to as many people as possible and have discussions. And so one of the things I learned immediately in this endeavor was everybody has a different opinion on what needs to be done, right? There are many different ways to do the same thing, especially in a drought-ridden location like ours that doesn't have that many resources, especially healthy soil and water. So I started planning together a workshop. We had done a number of other workshops already. And then Quivira took over. And I was so incredibly grateful. I cannot tell you and emphasize more. They are the A+ gold standard of planning. And I really think it's so important to plan and to cover all bases, which they did along the way. I wish they had more slides showing you, the packet they put together. And in fact, I had mine up because I just wanted to quickly go through it. They had basically an introduction, what to expect, the list of contacts. They had the agenda, directions on how to get here. So logistics, make sure everybody showed up, safety information, waiver, so liability waiver, safety rules, and then a photo release. So they covered, once again, they covered all bases, something I had been doing for many generations. And so I was just so incredibly grateful and appreciative of all that groundwork they did. So I think, once again, coming together, with the experts that they mentioned, I had already met Gabby Coughlin at the soil testing lab at the Agri-Nature Center in Albuquerque at an event that she had hosted. I had been working with Janella Cruz of the NRCS because we applied for this Healthy Soil Program grant, which required us to reach out to them. So those relationships have been built already. And then we came together and everybody, knew exactly what the purpose was because Quivira had put the outline together. And one of the wonderful things that happened that day was Janella and Gabby were really appreciative to have been invited to that day because they had never actually met in person, even though they were some of the formidable soil experts in their field. So we got a lot of credit for that. And once again, it ended up being an amazing day. So lots of credit there. I don't know if there's much more to say on that respect. I'm open to questions, or if Eva, you want to take this in a different direction.
Sure. I just want to know, what did you learn from your baseline soil monitoring? Were you surprised by anything, or were you like, yep, I figured that? Yeah. What
Yeah,
popped out?
so what I learned was, and what we intended to learn was, how do you test the soil, right? And so we were presented with a number of different tests, which we actually implemented that day. As you, Amy, had said, you could send the soil to the lab, which we did as well. We sent it to the Cornell Soil Testing Lab. But at the same time, ultimately, as a farmer rancher, I wanted to know how to do it ourselves, right? I'm not going to wait for the results every time I send it across the country to Connecticut to figure out, like, are we doing a good job here? What's happening? So that was one of the reasons why I really appreciated this workshop. We learned a lot on how to test it ourselves, and hopefully I keep good records so that the next time we test in 6 months or a year, we see if we've made progress. Luckily, I would tell you a small anecdote is that we had the soil testing workshop, and then we had a weekend workshop where we implemented water harvesting earthworks. So basically different types of dams. And then we planted cover crops. So we put down soil, seeds, and then hay mulch. And we had been debating for a number of months whether or not we were going to put drip line irrigation there. But then in a conversation with Catherine and a few other people, they persuaded me to just let nature take its sway. And then miraculously, or well planned somehow, 2 weeks later, we had four days of rain in October, and all of a sudden we had a field of green. It was really incredible. So don't know if that's just an anecdote. I was trying to figure out what was the question. So the other thing I want to mention, though, and I think this is important, because Ava and I had a discussion as to, she wanted me to talk about, well, what can be done better? And I hadn't really thought of anything. But I think what might help is, as a farmer, as a rancher, conservationist, ecosystem restoration, anybody you deal with, we are so incredibly busy, especially when we're working against the odds, that I have the book, we've had this workshop, but quite frankly, I'm not sure how often I'm going to go back to it. There's just so much to be done. So I think follow-up is critical to success in a program like this. Like, if you can set, a check-in 6 months later, and maybe a reconvening of the original meeting a year later to help that producer, check their soil, I think that would be exceedingly helpful.
Oh, you should be careful what you ask for now. I'm telling you measured your soil yet?
I'd love for you all to come visit again anytime.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Lorenzo. We're gonna take a very short break. Feel free to get up, get water. I'm gonna go on the fly here and keep us with a big group first, because I think one thing that happened last time was people had questions specifically for the plan partner. So maybe we'll come back, we'll take about 10 minutes of questions, and then we can go into breakout groups and sort of discuss amongst ourselves and like dig into how that resonated for what we know and what expertise we have. So with that, stretch your legs, get a quick break, and we'll see you shortly. Do come back though, more to come. Thanks. All right. Hopefully people come cruising on back. A quick palate cleanser there. Yeah, I'll open it. I think we've gotten some questions in the chat, but I'll just let make some time feel free to come off mute. If it gets too nitty gritty in the weeds, we may ask that to go offline a little bit, but yeah, big picture. We've talked about how the baseline monitoring fits into the whole plan process, how it could be used to move forward. We've seen an example of how it could be implemented that brings in that networking. So what questions do you have, or what would you like to share with the full group? And thanks for the folks who've been in the chat. Oh, Kristen, you might be muted or if you
Sorry.
were, okay.
I'm sorry, I missed it. I just ran to get a snack and I just came back. So I didn't catch your full question. I beg your pardon.
Do people have questions for the full group before we dive into breakout groups?
Well, I actually have a question. So I don't really, I'm not a part of this program. I'm an observer, I guess, and I'm very interested in becoming a planning partner, I guess, and working with you. I have a Healthy Soil grant. I have a big NRCS grant. I love what Lorenzo is doing. And I'm very interested in figuring out how to do that up here in Mora County, especially after the fires, and how to work in partnership with as many folks as I can. And so I am so inspired by what I'm hearing, and I actually got to meet Lorenzo because I bought a Johnson 2 bioreactor off of him. And it's just funny how it all kind of falls into place. It's fascinating. In my travels, I think like minds, I'm 54, I'm a retired PhD who now is doing farming for many of the reasons Lorenzo mentioned. And I want to give back, and I want to be part of this program. So I'm so glad I found it. And this is my second time, I guess this is the second in the series. And I had no idea what to expect. So this is great. So that was a lot, but.
Great. Yeah, thanks. And I think, just from seeing our initial survey of who all was here, we did have a mix. We had agency, we had academic, we had a lot of different people here. And so I think that is really a testament to how useful having a framework can be for lots of people who are, going towards the goals of resilient local communities and a fair and healthy food system and all these things. Like, there are a lot of ways to get involved, and finding some shared vision and moving towards it with lots of partners is really good. I think one thing I'll say to that is don't give up. A no is usually not a no, it's usually a not now. Because as Lorenzo put it, people are pouring their heart and soul into things, and especially y'all up in Mora County dealing with the post-fire stuff, it's hard to get somebody on the phone sometimes, and it just means not now, right? And like internally, we often talk about like, we're going to do the best we can with the people we have, and where we are and what we got, right? And like and to move forward with that rather than waiting for some perfect time or waiting for some perfect collection of people. So I think, yeah, exactly. And I think that's that beautiful piece of building some network is, man, if that person isn't available this month, maybe there's 2 other people who you could call to move forward on whatever you need to do.
If I may add a couple of things. Well, first of all, I just started a new course with Gaia Education called Cultivating Resilient Livelihoods. And it's been going on for a couple of weeks. It's a 12-week course, but would highly recommend something like that to you, Kristen, or anybody else interested.
Thank you.
Yeah. But the other thing is, I think part of the formula of our success is that we're not just focused on regenerative agriculture. You know, I'm on the school board for a local charter school where my children go to school. I recently was awarded a fellowship by the Johnson's, also I forget that Robert Johnson Foundation on racial equity. So that there's a component of community building, especially within immigrant and Mexican communities. Done a lot of conservation work. So for me, the strategy has been trying to spread like a connection and network and build a web around what we're all doing, because it's all so interconnected. And I think that has really been helpful to us in many different ways.